Good. Welcome, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Wood, and today is our free healing. I wanted to make it free. It definitely is a special thing that we can do together when we get together in this capacity to really look at how how the power of words and communication have both healed us. Certainly, words heal, but they also have created a wound. And this wound is very deep. I want to describe this wound so you can get a feel for it. And so the healing begins now, okay? And I'm not a traditional, normal type of healer. I'm going to do this very verbally. I'm going to walk you through this so you can feel it. So it's more of a guided healing. And I'm going to give you an opportunity throughout our time together to use some of the tools I teach, and I'll again walk you through step by step doing this. And so just for posterity's sake, make sure your mic is muted so that the recording is clear. So let's look at this wound. I want you to see what I can see. And that's the beauty of being a seer, is that I get to share this seeing, and then you get to look at it for yourself from your vantage point. Right? And so no two seers see the same thing. No two people see the same thing. And that's why when we do this, especially making it free, then you'll be able to look at it for yourself and share this idea with others. So the healing can actually grow. So the healing's going to be for you today, yes, but it's ultimately for humanity. As you know, nothing is personal. Any inner work we do opens it up for the collective. And so as you allow this inner work to be done today, this is helping to carve a path in consciousness for all of the other people on the planet to receive healing also. And that's the ultimate goal. So I want to show you what I can see about this. And I got thrown visually in meditation to the very beginning of when humankind came to the planet. So this healing's perfect timing, because that original experiment, which was 500,000 years old, is done now. It's finished. This is a brand new experiment. So it's really excellent and important that we can do some of the deepest healing right now. November and December are healing time. It's healing time. It's time to get as clear, crystal clear as we can in our embodiments, because 2021 is the entrance of the beginning of something totally new. So we have this chance, and this is so key. And so I thank you. First, I want to thank you. Thank you for being willing to be healed. I myself resist healing all the time. I resisted because I was brought up to believe that I could do it myself, to value independence. And that's not what the new experiment's going to be based on. It's based in unity, not codependence, not even interdependence, but unity. And that looks very different than what we're used to. So we're going to have to end up redefining all these things anyway. So I encourage you right now to be willing to lift up everything you know and everything you believe, and especially everything you think you know about unification, about communication, because we got to put all this out, every little bit of everything we believe or everything we know, we think we know. It's got to shift. It's got to be redefined. The floor, the foundation of reality is becoming more formless. And so that's what's necessary. And that includes communication. So the training I'll do later today after this healing is going to be a training about new communication. And it may be quite different than we're used to. We got to get used to it. Got to get used to formlessness. We got to get used to living in a new place called the gap of knowledge. The gap of knowledge is where we're going to live from now on. There's this funny little doorway. There's a funny little doorway of what we think we know, what we believe we truly do know, and what we just don't know. And that's where we're going to live. Gap of knowledge. This really cool little narrow path that's going to lead us into a new paradigm of empowerment. So to empower you, I want to show you what happened. What happened to communication? Early at the very beginning of the experiment, before Homo sapiens were even arrived, there was the Great Council of Light. And they were the ones who took this nice, fresh gift of DNA that had never been programmed, it had never been used. It was some of the original DNA, very ancient, billions of years old. And the Lyrans brought it to the council and said, hey, we know you were worried about all the galactic wars being in the embodiment of your new experiment. And we know that what you have right now is all of the DNA, it's all this DNA that actually is quite traumatized. It's been traumatized for, millions and millions of years around the galactic wars. So we want to give a gift to the experiment. Fresh DNA doesn't have any trauma in it, but it also has no wisdom either. It's just empty. So we would have started out as just total consciousness babies if the Galactic Council hadn't have taken the next step. The next step was to encode some of the very most deep and powerful essences of wisdom into DNA that was being gifted to the whole experiment of consciousness, right? And so the experiment in consciousness had to be coded with this wisdom, and this was experiential wisdom. So for example, the concept of healing. Well, we didn't need to know every little mistake and every little success about what healing was. What we needed to know is, what is healing? What is healing according to our galactic ancestors? So they condensed it down into what we would call an ancient template of wisdom. And there's 94 of them. And they were encoded into DNA one by one. The very first one being love. One of those ancient templates of wisdom was communication, actually. So communication was one of the very first basis of wisdom, foundations of wisdom that was encoded into our Homo sapien DNA. Now we fast forward. A lot of incredible power and energy and creativity went into making sure this experiment could get off on the right foot. And of course, it elicited a lot of interest from a galactic scenario, both from beings who were practicing power over paradigm and beings who were trying to empower an experiment with Gaia. Not on Gaia, with her, right? So the very first humans had a very nice, pure understanding of the 94 ancient templates of wisdom. And it was mainly the first 90 that were truly in the body. The last 4 they're not in the body. They're in the light body. So the last 4 are timelessness, formlessness, the universe containing all things, and the void. And so those don't live in the body, but they're part of our light bodies, and they're subtle. But they lead you to the edges of the universe, those last 4 do. Nonetheless, communication is very key. And so in the Homo sapien body, that template of wisdom change the form of the body. DNA is both encoded and mapped out by very specific layers of multidimensional information. And that creates a physical form, but the physical form itself is constantly being informed by the soul. So the soul actually ends up creating this form, the way we look at it. That's why when somebody does a lot of trauma healing, that's why while you do this healing, you're going to feel your body change. That's why. That's why when someone really does that inner work to attain oneness, their bodies change. They look brighter, lighter, they look different, younger. That's why. It's because the soul is actually changing the body. So this is the opportunity we have. The damage that has happened since that time is immense, and it can change our bodies to do this healing and to continue to practice it. But you need to know what happened and why. So at the very beginnings, we have this very pure type of communication. And this very pure type of communication was what I call the very eighth dimensional level of speaking. Now, there's actually beings that live in the eighth dimension, and I call them light talkers. And one of the attributes of a light talker is that they have zero misunderstandings. They have no miscommunication. Because when they communicate to each other, they do so in merger. They merge very physically, they do, whatever physicality can be in the eighth dimension. They merge, and so there's no miscommunication. There's no subtlety either. There's no personalities clashing. There's no traumas clashing. There's no distortion. There's no distortion. So here we have the very first humans who were technically enlightened, okay? We're technically enlightened. And the enlightenment of the very first humans had to do with the physicality not having any trauma built up in the DNA. Nice, fresh, beautiful, clear DNA, free of genetic trauma. And of course, the purity of the soul coming into the embodiment. And so that combination is what we call an enlightened person. So the very, very first humans were all enlightened. And that's really key to remember. It's written in your DNA. And we'll have that memory from the very first of our ancestors show up for us today. What would that be like? To not have any distortions, trauma, ego, expectations, to not have any distortions bother the field of communication. Right? What would that really be like? It's there. It's actually there in your DNA. This memory of how that was is there. That's why a lot of us will say, you know, I feel like I remember a different time where we were all getting along, where everybody made sense to everybody else. What happened? And that's totally normal. That's actually incredibly normal and important because it's true, it's real. There was a time like that at the beginning. So then, of course, we had the agenda of the power over paradigm show up, totally hijacking our experiment many times over, not just once. When that occurred, there was the very beginnings of division and misunderstanding through expectations and through trauma. And of course, the buildup of trauma turns into ego. Trauma is consciousness under pressure. Ego is trauma under pressure. And so the buildup of ego began at that time. Now, one of the ancient stories that we all know is that of Adam and Eve. And of course, they weren't the only first humans. It's just that they were the very first to fall for the power over paradigm agenda. And that's why that story is leaned upon as the beginnings of our distortions. And in that story, who was the one who was encouraging distortion? Of course, we know it as the snake. And everyone likes to call him Satan, but Satan's not really a snake. He, there were beings who came and hijacked the experiment. And they've been interested in that experiment and this one in particular for eons, many billions of years, not just when we came along. And their interest was to always create power over situations so they could continue to maintain their own gathering of power. We know them by many names, and of course, we can, by naming them, begin our healing. And so we know our brethren in space, in the galaxy, as the Draconians, who came to interfere with our experiment. And I want you to feel how that word makes you feel. Of course, no single race can be painted with one paintbrush. And I want you to know that there are beings of that particular race, that particular species who are deeply good, who are deeply kind and want healing. And so I want you to find it in your body, that beginning of distortion, the beginning of misunderstanding, the beginning of miscommunication, and the beginning of our communication trauma. Where does it show up in your body? And it's going to be different for everybody, perhaps. But for me, it actually shows up on my right side here in my heart space. It feels like a wound is opened in my embodiment. And so that's the first step. Notice the beginning of this story and how it really affects you. How does it show up in your body? So now, if you can notice it, if there's any tension in the body, if there's any energy that tightens up, right? Makes my whole right wrist actually tighten up, like I'm going to protect myself, right? Just notice that and see if you can go into it a little bit. So I want you to make yourself small like this and go into that spot in your body where this shows up, where the beginnings of the distortion show up. So when you notice that, let yourself sit in that spot in your body and see what shows up there. Is there any colors? Are there any structures? Is there just a feeling? What feeling is it? For me, it feels really heavy. It feels very painful, like that part of my body is lead. And it feels really sad. It feels very sad. And it's very dense. It's very dark. And when I sit there in it, I see a kind of a rabbit hole. Certainly was a rabbit hole that got created, right? I see something that goes down into my embodiment and takes me on this journey deep into how communication has been distorted for all of humanity. And so I just want you to notice it, and we're going to sit with this and just welcome it. All we have to do is welcome this. I welcome this feeling of heaviness. I welcome the density. I welcome the original trauma. You're welcome here. I want to know you. I want to understand you so that there is no more power over me. And then take a big, deep breath. So this communication piece continued in the ancient story. It continued to create distortion. And what it looked like in time then is the next story we remember, the story of Cain and Abel. What happened between them was not just a distortion in communication, but an omission of communication. So when there's ego and trauma, it creates a density, it creates a lack of connection, right? So then what happens is all of our thoughts and our communications, instead of them being very pure, instead of people being able to not take anything personally when someone would express themselves, instead of there being clarity, instead of there being an ease for people to truly be themselves as a soul and not worry about other folks taking it through their pain, their ego, their personalities, and then receiving it as distorted. There instead was created a bouncy house in the mind. And so the bouncy house in the mind, what's it do? Well, the ego and the trauma, they create quite the box. And when someone wants to communicate, instead of it being a full body communication, instead of it being mind, heart, gut, and soul, with ease, with grace, being able to communicate, the walls, the density of trauma, the density of ego created a bouncy house of energy and thoughts. So now your communication, your thoughts, your hopes, your feelings, they bounce around inside, hitting your ego, hitting your personality, hitting your trauma, until they become so distorted that one of two things happens. The communication out loud is truly from the mind and not from the whole body, and thus is distorted by that dense lens of ego and trauma, and easily misunderstood by those who are going to take it and let those words bounce around in their bouncy house too. Trauma ping pong, like we have called it before. Or the person ends up not saying anything at all. And now the communication, instead of it being pure, instead of it coming from the whole body and soul, instead of there being no fear of misunderstanding or miscommunication, now there's the omission of communication, purposefully held back because the ego is afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of being honest, for the possibility that the other person will misunderstand it, afraid of having to end up in some kind of conflict because of their true feelings that they wanted to share. And so the mind is quite capable of taking that energy, that communication, and distorting it in the mind's bouncy house of ego and trauma, so much so that the mind decides that it won't share it at all. And that's what happened with Cain and Abel. Cain, because he inherited the trauma of his parents through the beginnings of the distortion of human communication, omitted his true feelings. And it built up energy and power. It built up anger, anxiety. It built up inner pain. And it created more and more ego and more rage. And those thoughts could never move through his heart. so that he could be true and real with his brother. And Adam and Eve were part of that. And then Abel himself also had inherited this, but his communication was also that of unconsciousness. So Abel wasn't able to be conscious about what was going on with his brother. He was cut off from that communication because of Cain's fear of vulnerability. And there was nothing Abel could do. He might have tried to communicate, or maybe he didn't. And the fact is, probably he didn't because he didn't know. He too had enough ego and trauma blocking him from being able to be intimately connected, full body, mind, heart, and gut with his brother. So the rage built up in Cain to the point of him having a final outburst that was so violent that it murdered his brother. What really murdered his brother? That distortion, the ego, the trauma that he had inherited from his parents. And that's how fast, in one generation, that's how fast and how powerful trauma is. Imagine that times 5,000 years. And that's what we're here to heal today. But now you know where the pain and the wound of omission and the pain and the wound of misunderstanding and miscommunication, where they come from. And so find that story in your body now. We found the first story, which was Adam and Eve and the entrance of the power over agenda. And then we found the second story, the outcome of that inherited trauma to create misunderstanding through omission and fear of vulnerability instead of extraordinary joy to be able to share the whole full body truth of our experience. At the beginning, there wasn't any of that. There wasn't a fear that when I would say something that someone would take it personally or misunderstand me. There wasn't any fear like that at the beginning. And with one single event, there then became the beginnings of that fear, like a snowball getting bigger and bigger as it rolls down the hill, built up in the whole system over one generation, strong enough that it created even a murder between brothers. That's how serious this is of a wound. So let's notice the story of omission, the fear of vulnerability in our body. Where does it show up in your body? Put yourself there now. Make yourself very small. Go deep into the body. What do you see? What do you feel? Welcome it. I welcome this distortion. I welcome my fear of vulnerability. I welcome my fear of being misunderstood. I want to know you, and I want to heal you. I want to heal you by knowing you so well that there is no longer power over me, creating fear as it has been. And just say with me now, I welcome you in my whole body and my whole field now. And take a deep breath. Good. And now we move right along in the story. That's only the beginning. And so we have the children of Cain. As I said before, there were lots of people besides Adam and Eve at the beginning. And Eden itself was consciousness. It was a state of mind. It wasn't a place. Gaia herself is Eden. And Eden is a consciousness. Eden was the place where, in consciousness, it's written in your DNA, you can remember it, it's there, where your consciousness did not fear vulnerability, where all of our ancestors were enlightened and they were able to be 100% open and transparent and notice each other in subtlety without causing any fear between each other or misunderstanding. But Cain ended up finding a city. He left his parents' home and he found a city. And that's where the next wound of communication starts. It used to be thought in archaeology and anthropology that the concept of a stationary city is really new, and it's not. It's not at all. Humans like to live close together, they do. It's that now when you get that close together and you get so many people together, instead of a single tribe, you have a city of millions. That magnifies distortion. But Cain found a new tribe, and they had been stationary for some time. So they had built a city. Now, this is when that next distortion comes in. Here's a total stranger who's just murdered his brother, so he's probably both grieving and he's hating himself. He got banished from his family. Adam and Eve had many, many children, not just two. He got banished. There was just no way. So that fear of banishment because of omission or misunderstanding, because of trauma and ego, that's written in our DNA too. If I say what I really want to say, if I say it from my soul, will I get banished? Will my friends leave? Will people take it personally and maybe take it wrong or misunderstand me? All of it's there. That's there. It's real. It's in you. So notice that fear of banishment and notice its sibling. Here Cain comes to the gate of a tribal city, and now he has to be seen as worthy enough to come into and be part of a new tribe. Do you think that he told them he just murdered his brother? Definitely not. Would you? Would you if you were trying to come into a new tribe? No, so we have more omission in communication. And now we have a facade that's created. Cain had to try to remake himself in a new image that wasn't real so he could be accepted. So it's not just any acceptance, it would be a facade of self that would be accepted, not true Cain, not his soul, who he really was, not his truth. And what happened? They let him in. They let him in. And he was brought into a new tribe. Can you imagine fearing your whole life now that someone might find out who you are? That you are the murderer, and not just any kind of murderer, the murderer of a kin. And so now the facade must be upkept. The facade has to be upkept. And that distorts communication even worse. So now when Cain really wants to express himself, if it was hard before, now it's impossible. Because what if the old Cain gets found out? What if the old self becomes vulnerable? Now there's even more at stake. So now the distortion of self, in order to be accepted by a culture, by an economic system, by a politics, by a society, no matter how large or small, a distorted facade put out there into the world to make you look better than you are cultivates self-hatred. It cultivates deep, deep unworthiness and worthlessness. And I want you to find that now. The facade that Cain had to wear is in your DNA. That memory is there. And the fear and the pain of banishment because of the events of trauma that played out. But also banishment by our own words, because of our own words, despite our words even. So notice that fear of banishment and the facade that we create to create acceptance, even though it cultivates more and more inner lies and more self-hatred. Where does that show up in your body? This polarity. Notice it in your body. Go into it. Make yourself small again. Go deep into the body. What do you see there? Are there any structures? Are there any people? Is there color? How does it feel? Now I want you to welcome it. I welcome this. I want to know you. I want to know you so well that this has no power over me anymore. You are welcome here in my body. And now take a deep breath. Good. So once Cain was accepted into this new tribe, there was the creation of and continued manifestation of the power over paradigm, again brought forth by our galactic brethren who practiced that particular type of power, right? The draconians. They're our cousins, so we include them in our galactic family. And certainly some of them have caused these problems at the beginnings, but we also have to be responsible for ourselves. We can't, of course, be responsible for the choices of our ancestors, but any type of power over has to include a victim, because that tyrant victim dynamic is a polarity. That's what that is all about. Once it got seeded in DNA, it gets played out. There doesn't even have to be any draconians around for something like that to get played out in DNA. And so many cities began to pop up all over. And all these different beautiful humans began to connect. And some of them remained nomadic, hunter-gatherers, and others were pastoralists and stayed put. But nonetheless, humans always had a continuous stream of connection from town to town and city to city, and nomadic group and between nomadic groups. And this deep connection was what we might call the very first commerce. But this commerce initially brought of excitement, brought of joy. Hey, I have more than I need of this. I wonder if I bring some of these things to the market or to a different town or to a different tribe. I wonder if they've got extra of something that I'd really like or need. And thus began the first bartering and trading. There was no money. Zero, nada, nothing. There was no money. Money's really quite modern. There was no money. There was a lot of things that had a lot of value, certain dyes, for example, because it would take so much effort to make a dye of, for example, purple or blue. Certain precious metals always had immense value. Gold and silver always did, because of their healing properties mainly. But then what happens? What happens with that facade? Well, there might be an interaction that has occurred. And the person you're trading with or bartering with, maybe they have a big ego. And you really want this trade. And so what do you have to do in order to make sure you're not a victim of some scam or somebody who's got a huge ego and thinks that what they have is more valuable than it really is? What do? You rise to meet them. You rise to meet the ego. Why wouldn't you? We rose to meet the egos of those around us. And this creates a stair-step effect where two people in consciousness, one's ego is a little bigger than the other. In order to get what you need, in order to meet your own needs, you've had to make sure you weren't their victim, right? That they couldn't have power over you. Because in that moment, they know they have what you need, and they do. They have this power over you. All this is the distortion of communication trauma, right? So what happens? You rise to meet their ego. Well, the next time someone comes along that's less egoic than you, perhaps, then they have to rise to meet your ego. And you're certainly going to find someone else who's got a bigger ego a little later on too. And then you got to rise. It's a big stair-step effect. And we do it together. We do it together. The distortion gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, this can be done in consciousness, of course, so we can become, instead of bigger, we become lighter and lighter and lighter together. And good communication can do that. Good communication can do that. And that's what I hope to train you to do later today. But in the meantime, this is what's happening to the human race, and this goes on for eons. And by the time the patriarchy comes around, everyone's totally traumatized by the victim tyrant dynamic that has been set in place at the very early echelons of human consciousness. So I want you to notice that in your body. All the many hundreds of thousands of people who unconsciously, step by step together, built a lot of facades and ego to protect themselves so they could get their needs met. It wasn't because they're all malicious. They weren't malicious. They were just trying to get their needs met. And so have we been trying to do that in the patriarchy. It's no one's fault that there's so much distortion in our communication. It's no one's fault. It's 500,000 years of distortion being magnified. So there's no blame to put on here. I'm not even blaming those that have been playing in the power over energies either. Again, we had to have an interaction with that eventually, and it happened really early. So all of this is, of course, perfect, and it is going to end up perfectly because of the work you're doing. But here we have that distortion, the facades, right? The facades of, hey, this is really me, and aren't I beautiful, and don't you want to communicate with me, and you really should trade with me because, right? And that's the beginnings of what we know as the Matrix. The Matrix started in the mind, right? The Matrix started in this, through this distortion of communication. That's how it started. It was in the very beginnings as we stair-stepped ourselves into more ego. Notice how that feels in your body. There's so many people who were part of that, who were damaged by it, right? And what does that look like when you go home and you're alone after these kinds of interactions? How do you really feel about yourself? Do you feel enriched? Do you feel understood? Do you feel known without your inner private thoughts being so vulnerable that people might shame you or hurt you? Do you feel understood? Or is the fear of that vulnerability, is the fear of shame, is the fear of banishment, and this deep desire for acceptance at whatever cost? That shows up. It's now become so unconscious in our bodies that our families have continued the victim tyrant communication all these eons. And it's extremely rare to find anyone who's conscious about it. It's extremely rare to be able to say the things from our whole body, not just our mind, to reveal the self, to allow the personal to open up into the universal, right? It's extremely rare. And those who have discovered this is possible, they struggle, you struggle, we all do, to try to practice it. And it's a two-way street, to not take anything personally at all. A person's personal inner field is not ours, right? And when they reveal a little bit of that, does it hurt us? Does it get run through our ego and our trauma? Does it hit something in you? Because if there's a reaction, that reaction is trauma that's built into your personal field. And that trauma isn't theirs. It doesn't have anything to do with them or their trauma. Right? So I just want you to notice this, that this has been something that's been magnified and has occurred over many billions and billions of souls' experiences. And you have that in you, the immensity of this. And I want you to welcome them. Welcome all of your ancestors who did this so they could get by and survive. And just welcome them. You are welcome here, my family, my human family. Everything that's happened, all the distortion, all that ego, all that trauma. All the continued buildup of ego by people taking communication and running it through their trauma and their ego, and it getting twisted by the mind, who's just trying to help you survive. I welcome all of that. I welcome all of the trillions of interactions that led up to this moment in my life and all the lives of my ancestors. I welcome it now. And take a deep breath. Good. And so now we start to begin to enter into the modern era. And as an anthropologist, modern to me means the beginnings of the patriarchy. So between 10 and 5,000 years ago, which sounds like really long time, but it's not. That's modern in my thinking. So we enter into the modern era of about 10,000 years ago. And here we've actually got some money starting to show up. So money now, you take what extra things you have and you turn it into money, and then that money can buy anything. It can buy anything. It's not just trying to find somebody out there who needed your sheep and find that same exact person who needs your sheep, who also has the exact food that you needed. Now we have this other tool. We can turn the things that we have excess of into energy, gold and silver, which is highly valuable. And now that highly valued item can turn into anything else. So it's a great tool, totally handy, completely distorted. So here we have the entrance of money. Well, what happened? People realized, wow, if I turn all this excess into money, that means I can practically have anything I want. So I'd rather not have a bunch of sheep. Having a big bag of gold sounds way better. It's that simple. It's really that simple. Humans are not that complicated. It's that simple. Now we might call that greed, it became greed based off of a foundation of simple logic. Well, yeah, having a bag of gold would be better than having just 100 sheep, because that bag of gold can turn into anything, and 100 sheep has to be desired by somebody out there, right? And then the greed began. Well, I'd rather have 100 bags of gold. Then I'll never have to do anything again. Now I can do all the fun things I want. Now I can do anything I want instead. I don't have to work. I can pay people to do that. Welcome in the 1%, right? Welcome in that energy of power over, richer or poorer. And here's then a deeper dynamic. Then you end up having the feminine who stepped down from their positions of power, handed the reins of power over to the masculine, and said, give it a try. Let's see what you do with this. Since you want it so much, what will you do with the reins of power? And some of the masculine took that on, not all of them. The patriarchy isn't 100% of men in power over all the time. But what it certainly was the lowering of the class of the feminine. So the female then were second class citizens, or worse, less than that, turned into basically slaves. And many, many men ended up in that position too. So now we have a very specific set of men in power. Again, all this is things we've learned from. We wouldn't be here now talking if it weren't for all of this, by the way. So we're not tossing out our history here. We're going to literally merge with it. That's what the healing is. So now we have the patriarchy, and it's continuing to distort communication by running it through this value system, the value system of the political economy, which is born of this patriarchy. And what archy means, patriarchy, means complete and total power over. And of course, that's familiar. Complete and total power over is something we were taught. We were taught this. So before we get real deep into the patriarchy, I want you to feel that. Feel the beginning of the patriarchy in your body. The way that the distortion of power over caused so much communication distortion and so much distortion in all realms of human culture that it manifested into an entire new system of power where only certain groups of people could be heard, could be believed, could be understood, where only certain groups of people had any power in their social systems or structures or families, where only certain groups of people could participate in political economy, and where only certain people had control over how humanity met their needs, including the distribution of wealth and food and even health. I want you to feel that in your body. It feels quite intense. It's in my whole body, and I think some of you are feeling it too. It almost feels metallic to me, and I don't want to project what I'm feeling onto you, so I'm just going to keep my mouth shut about that. But I want you to notice this, the very beginnings of the patriarchy. It feels like being slammed into a jail cell, because what it really was the final physicality of the matrix becoming real in the 3D. The matrix itself, a multidimensional creation, is pure power over. It's pure archy. And it's not just men, it's a lot more than that. It had to do with many different beings from many different dimensions playing in power over alongside us, because of us, and over us. And let's welcome this memory of the beginning of the patriarchy in our body. I welcome you. You are welcome here. And then take a big deep breath. Yeah, there's a lot of layers out of that. So just notice the layers. Notice the layers of density and trauma. There's a lot of people who are deeply traumatized by the entrance of the patriarchy, men and women both. Just notice that. Again, we're merging with this so that it can be truly known, right? We need to know this as a soul. And once we know it as a soul, it doesn't have power over us anymore. So we're gently ending the power over paradigm together today. So let's walk through this patriarchy energy. What happened to communication then? It was extraordinary, deeply painful. If you feel grief or sadness come up over this, let it flow through, let it move through you. It's not just yours, it's your ancestors too, both men and women, suffering because of this. And we especially then have a division between the masculine and feminine being able to communicate properly. Lots of distortion there. And then we have the outplay, what we might call the darkest times in human history, or the past 5,000 years. These dark times, they ended up causing people to create even more intense facades, right? More intense facades. So then you have different roles showing up, different archetypal roles. The powerful priest or cardinal, the powerful mother of the abbey, the abbess, with power over all of these women in her abbey, right? The powerful householder, the powerful political position, the powerful person who could hold property, and the one that can't, otherwise known as a slave. Even in some of what we consider highly advanced societies coming out of Greece or Rome, they had slaves They had slaves. And usually they were we would consider them. Usually the slaves were totally their brethren. They were citizens. They weren't just prisoners of war or prisoners from other countries. They often were born into that slavery. And there was no way to buy yourself out of that. You were born into it. Entrance in the caste system that the East took on really deeply. Notice that in your body, the caste system, where you're born into a certain family class and there's no way you're getting out of it. China, Japan, Korea, India, all of the Asiatic, Mongolia even, had a kind of different caste system. But that's exactly what it was. If you were born into a certain class, then you could be a concubine. But there was no way that you'd end up as an emperor. And stories where people did do that, well, those are the ones that we hear about in history. And then we have a false idea that somehow or another we're going to be able to do it too, or get out of our born situations. And so there's the tragedy of both the energy of, if you work hard enough, you're going to be able to be free, which was a false facade. And then the despair of, well, I was born like this, and I'll never be able to get out of this. I'm stuck here. If you ever looked in the mirror and said, oh, I wish I was not a man or a woman. Many of us have done that when we look in the mirror and we say, oh my gosh, I wish I wasn't a woman. I wish I wasn't a girl. Why can't I have been a boy? This is dumb. My brothers get to do these things and I don't. Oh, I wish I wasn't this color of skin. Oh, I wish I wasn't from this country and come to a different country or born in another country because I don't fit in. Or even wilder, many of us have had this happen too. I wish I wasn't human. This is where the beginnings of that deep self-hatred, the human hate program, come from. The human hate program was born of the distortion of communication and magnified by the patriarchy. And so if you've wondered where some of these thoughts of self-hatred come from, even if you say, really, I don't really hate myself, why do these thoughts come up? I do want to be here. I am in this body. I really do want to be here. Is it fun and comfortable? No. But I do, but I also, I'm struggling. I feel this, that I don't want to be here. That's not you. It's your genetics. It's your ancestors. Thousands and thousands of them. Born into these positions, having to wear ever deeper, ever thicker facades to get their needs met. Even our ancestors who did have total power, if they had total power, they were either going to get drawn really deep into corruption and the buildup of continued distorted communication, being run through ego trauma, and now the solidification of that level of trauma in society and political economy, dividing up further and further those who get to decide who gets fed and who gets jobs, and those who are simply told what's going to happen to them. They either get drawn into that corruption if they're in a state of power, or they suffer immensely, hating and wanting something different. Not all people at the very tops of the patriarchy enjoyed being there, is what I'm trying to say. Some of those men especially were deeply traumatized by what they witnessed because they could not say anything. They were forced to be quiet. The pain of omission is real. When you can't say anything, because then all your power would be taken away and your whole family would be hurt. That's where the omission of communication and power began, at the beginnings of the patriarchy, when those who were born into power ended up being silent as the tragedy unfolded before them. The tragedy of the corruption. And so now you have a very clear set of polarities. You have those who are not in power, terrified to speak out about it for being crushed and remaining voiceless in that pain of omission, just like Cain. Just like Cain. And then you have those who got fed up with it and tried to speak out. And what happened to them? And then you have those at the top, those who were not corrupt, wanting to change the dynamics of power, but so powerless to speak about it because they would end up dead too. And then those who bought into the corruption in order to survive. That's as simple as it was. It's no more complex than that. The corrupted eventually become so sociopathic that they pass that narcissism and sociopathy down. Just like the trauma distortion of communication has been passed down. Let's notice them. Bring them into your heart. How do these groups make you feel? How does it make you feel in your body? Find it in your body. Find the strangling of the voice being shut down. Find the destruction of the voice by pure power over. Find that pain of omission by both those in victimhood and in tyranthood or power over. And then find the corrupted in your lineage, those who were corrupted by the power over, so much so that it turned into sociopathy and narcissism. Find it in your body. Notice how it makes you feel. That's all you need. You don't need to know the exact details. And we welcome this. We welcome all of them. You are welcome here. We want to know you. We want to know you so fully that this no longer has power over us, that it no longer distorts us anymore. This is what we desire from our souls, from our hearts. You are welcome in this love. And take a big, deep breath. Now we get closer and closer to the present. I want you to think about your grandparents. If you ever had the ability to meet them or not, bring them forward, bring your grandparents forward. They were the ones who began to be more conscious of all of these things, whether they did the healing or really embodied that consciousness, probably unlikely. But this was the beginnings of the voiceless trying to step into a voice. And it started at the turn of the century, at least in North America. It started a lot of places at the turn of the century. The voiceless needing a voice, right? There was the beginnings of people noticing that. You can see this through our history, especially of, say, sociology. Women like Margaret Mead observing children and how their communication was different than that of the parents and how they'd have to learn distorted communication, right? It was the beginnings of human consciousness really beginning to examine ourselves, which eventually became anthropology. We hadn't really done much of that until then. So all this is quite fresh, for human time standards. So we have all of these people, men and women, beginning to observe how these children, especially children, would come in and they'd have these very different ways of interacting. They would hug each other. They would play with anyone. They would try to talk to someone who didn't have a similar language, and they'd make new languages. They would interact without prejudice. The children would. It wasn't until they were shamed for those things, when they were told that these divisions were necessary for society to stay strong. You cannot be friends with that person. You need to know our language. You cannot touch people. That was taught. And the facade was handed off. And I want you to find that with your grandparents. Again, you don't have to have ever known them. They're there. They were the ones who began to touch upon this in our consciousness field. Your grandparents could have been pure bigots. One of mine were, certainly. But it doesn't matter. They were part of a consciousness field of that time, the turn of the century. They were part of the consciousness field that began the self-observation wave of change. And that's when we began to have the voiceless victims begin to speak. Did that mean they weren't harmed or killed? No. It didn't. No, it didn't. But they connected to the incorrupted who were in power, and those who were in power began to speak as well, those who were incorrupted by the sociopathy. So we have a merger. There's a moment in time, and we're still watching this occur within the same matrix system, where those who were not corrupted by power and yet still in power began to help to lift up the voices of the victims who did not have power. So you have many men who helped support the suffragettes, for example. You have many men in power who supported the end of slavery. You have many people who were working to dissolve these needless facades of separation. And they still are, which is why we are still in this, and that's what we're doing right now, is to understand these facades so they can be dissolved. And like good spiritual scientists, we're noticing it in ourselves first. So I want you to notice that feeling that comes from that field of energy of humans beginning to observe ourselves and realize that a lot of the painful pieces are taught to us. Adam and Eve taught Cain that there are some sins that cannot be forgiven, and thus allowed the concept of banishment to exist in human consciousness. Banishment is not one of the 90 original ancient templates of wisdom. And neither is the complete and total corrupted sociopathy of power over. All of those are new in this experiment. They were brought through over time. But notice that shift, the voiceless finally being able to be heard because of those in power who were not corrupted by the power, observing the truth of human behavior, that culture is learned. How does it make you feel? How does the fact that any of your miscommunications, any of your trauma around communication at all, that it's truly been learned, how does that make your body feel? Just notice it. And we welcome it. We welcome our ancestors who began this observation. We welcome all of those in all those quadrants of victim and tyrant, and all those who remain neutral and observed as well. Because certainly there was going to be some pretty neutral players in every situation. But we need to welcome this. We need to welcome this shift in our body, because it was a really big change in consciousness. Without it, we would not be able to connect the way we do right now at all. You wouldn't be listening to me. I'm a girl and young. I fit into the exact position of someone who ought not to be heard. And just notice that doorway opening, that energy shift. And we welcome it fully in our body now. And take a big, deep breath. And now the next wounding. We know this so well. It's called the TV. The TV. The television. A young farmer named Philo Farnsworth, a genius engineer and inventor, created the very first television for his favorite fifth grade teacher, who really empowered him, and he loved her so much that he created the television. And when he showed it to her, he said, "I think this could become the greatest learning tool in the world." So he was certainly a prophet, not just an inventor. And what did that tool become? Like so many magnificent tools created, especially at the turn of the century, it was taken by the sociopathic power over and used as a tool for learning the power over paradigm and continuing to manifest it through communication. What is TV but simply a communication tool? And it wasn't your friends and family that you were going to watch. No, now you can learn directly from various people who you don't get to choose, who come through the television and visually and through sound teach you about the power over culture that was continuing to be maintained by the sociopathic tyrants. But why did this tool create this learning so well? Why did it work so well? Few people know what the television actually does to your brain. There's all these little pixels, and at first it was black and white. There's little pixels, which are like little mini TVs, little micro TVs on a screen built from a vacuum tube. And each little mini TV can have a different color, or black or white. And if you change the color on that little mini TV, the pixel, and you do it all at once, very quickly, within less than a second, but many, many hundreds and even thousands of times a second, then you have a picture and it moves. It gives the illusion of being in movement, and it also gives the illusion of something being in 3D. Well, it turns out that how fast those pixels change color completely hypnotize the brain. It causes the frontal lobe to go into a sort of numb state, which is hardly different than being actually hypnotized. Now, when someone's hypnotized, what do we know in psychology can happen to them? they can be subconsciously programmed. They can learn subconsciously. So you go to a trusted hypnotherapist. They put you under a hypnosis, sometimes even using movement, which the eye is perceiving on the TV, even though you're not consciously perceiving it. The eyes and the brain are totally perceiving it. And now that hypnotherapist plants seeds of information in your subconscious about losing weight or not eating sugar or stopping smoking or healing of some kind, perhaps, right? Wouldn't that be amazing if that was what was on the TV? That's not what's on the TV, as you know. So here we have our really close to home wound being taught a false global culture through an incredible, powerful tool that bypasses all of your logical mind and plants seeds in the subconscious about what to buy, what to wear, who to vote for, what to be afraid of, what to accept, and so many subtleties that you could study this for 1,000,000 years and never be done. And this wound is here in you now. It's yours. It's not just your ancestors. It's yours. And there might be some shame around TV. There might be some shame around watching certain things or having watched them. There might be a yucky feeling that just comes up about it. There might be some subconscious pressure in your body about this. There might be some anger and some rage and maybe even hate. Because the TV itself is not just a physical portal of information, it's also spiritual. Spiritual energy comes out of a television into your home, into your body, into your children's bodies. And it lifts up and continues to manifest division and hatred. It continues to manifest a power over paradigm. It manifests narcissism and sociopathy. Turn of the century, they didn't even have words for that. And now you can read the word narcissist in every other thing that comes out of the TV or any media at all. It's a common word now. And in fact, why wouldn't it be? We have way more narcissists now. Why? They were all brainwashed to be that way. They learned their culture, not from their families, not from their town or their tribe. They learned it. We've been learning it. Notice those feelings that show up in your body around this. Sit with them, look at them, face them. They need to be known by you so that they can be dissolved, so that they won't have power over you anymore. And so that these magnificent tools that people like Tesla and Philo Farnsworth, wonderful tools of learning, could be used again, could be used with light. That's possible. That's what we're doing right now. We're using the screen to heal. We're doing it so we know we can, and we know it's possible. But let yourself feel the pain of those tools being corrupted. The tools of communication being corrupted, right? Notice that. And let's welcome them. Welcome the wounds. Allow them. Merge with them so they don't have power over you anymore. And take a big, deep breath. I welcome you here in my body. Wow, that cleared my sinuses. Good, okay. One last piece here. One last piece. It's called the typed text. The typed text. And this comes in the form of obviously text messages on your phone, typed text such as newspapers in your hand, even online. It includes social media. It includes any kind of communication done through typed text alone, especially interpersonal. Now, what happens with this typed text? And why has it caused a wound? Well, originally, humans totally created typed text, though it wasn't really typed, it was literally chipped out of a stone. But boy, they would chip this stuff out, and it was real specific types of information. It was to keep track of accounts, it was messages between people, it was all sorts of different things. Typed text was even used in Roman times to cause division in politics. It sounds really odd, but the Romans would take pieces of clay pottery and carve out the name of the political leader they hated and sell them to people to wipe their butts with. Typed text, creating division. Pretty old, but if we come up now into the present, typed text was especially utilized by those in sociopathic corrupt power over positions to influence the masses and convince them that their inner thoughts and inner communications were wrong. It, in fact, divided the self from the self. It caused us to often question ourselves so deeply that we no longer trusted ourselves. Is that familiar? Do you trust yourself? Have there been moments in time when you read an article of some shape or form, or a post on social media, or a text from a friend about a situation or about an issue, and asked yourself, wow, I don't know if I trust my own opinion on this. What if what they're saying is true and I'm wrong? And with no way to truly validate what's being shared easily, that doubt plants seeds and it destroys us very slowly. It destroys us being able to connect not just through the mind, but through the whole body and the soul, to the truth, which you can feel in your body. But because we've been cut off from our heart and our gut, then the mind is trying its very best to make sense of this distortion, mostly failing. And then we make it really interpersonal. Now it's not just magazines and newspapers and things getting text anywhere. Now it's not just scientific writers writing papers to each other. Now it's not just cool novelettes or little books about people or culture anymore. Now you can go on a platform and you can read anyone's opinion, but is it undistorted? How do most of these posts all over the place, or how do these text messages and emails really make you feel? Do you feel like you're getting the fullness of a person's true soul? In fact, text is such a poor way to receive information because it can be so distorted. Often ask myself when I read something, would this person say that to me if they were standing or sitting in front of me? Most of the time, no. No, they wouldn't. When people get on little into fights, straight up fights on social media about any subject, really, they'll come up with all sorts of crazy things to say. Would they really act like that or talk like that in person? Most of the time, and there's exceptions, most of the time they wouldn't. They wouldn't. And even worse, now when we go to put a message out there on with our typing, we're drawn to being less understood in the truth of who we are. We're drawn to distorting what we're saying to make it sound a certain way to get a certain outcome. And then we depend on the other person's translation of that text. Now, let's say someone texts you a message on the cell phone. What voice are you reading that in? Is it the true voice of the person? How could you know that? You can't. There's no verbal, audio energy behind it. You can't hear exactly how they said it. You could say that one sentence 100 different ways and still probably not get exactly the nuances of how that person meant it. You can't hear their voice. You can't see their eyes or their body language. And so then all these texts, the text way of communicating is highly distorted. What someone might mean in the words that they say will be run directly through our ego and our trauma. And we interpret it that way, and it is distorted. And thus causes greater division between human beings. And thus is now one of the freshest wounds, the freshest wound within us around communication. That our true meaning and our true feelings and our true intent in our words is lost in translation, the translation of the ego and our trauma. That's why I could write this down all day long and you could read it. it would not have the same impact. You need to hear my voice and see my eyes and my body language to truly understand what I'm saying to you. This is natural. Humans didn't used to write stuff down. In fact, most of our existence, we didn't write anything down. It was only when we wanted to get specific things across to larger amounts of people at the same time that became useful, or to keep track of information that was necessary for structures to function. That was when writing became handy. What did we do before? We told stories, and they weren't fake stories. The Adam and Eve story wasn't written down. That was passed down word by word with great meaning, with great effort by the keepers of the true stories. And those stories, they were passed down, and apprentices would study very carefully the body language and the attitudes of those who passed the stories down verbally. With our bodies and our DNA, we pass this down. All of that got lost with text communication. And ironically, this year, we've been forced to be on video a lot more, do less text communication perhaps, and do a lot more work seeing each other. That's a good thing, I think. So I want you to notice that. Notice the feeling that the distortion that text communication has caused you. Has it caused pain and anger, frustration? Has it caused moments where you're like, I give up? Has it caused sadness? Has it made you feel unheard? Has it made you feel shame, rage, confusion? Notice those frequencies in your body where they show up. Look at them. And now we welcome them. I welcome you in my body. And take a deep breath. Good. Now I want to do one last heart command with you to finalize the embodiment of this incredible 500,000 years of communication and the great wounds that communication and the distortion of it, that very pure template of communication gifted to us by our galactic ancestors, and everything they learned about communication brought to its purest essence. Enlightened communication, compassionate communication, communication that doesn't cause interpersonal misunderstanding, communication that is not taken personally, but is welcomed into a field of full acceptance. That energy and all of the wounds that we've talked about, the historical wounds of communication that have occurred. We want to welcome all of the energy from both of these, the original communication and everything that's happened until this time now when we can claim it again for our new experiment next year. And so if you would say with me, dear heart, I welcome all of these energies. I welcome all of the pain and the wounds. I welcome the pain and the wounds of power over. I welcome the pain and the wounding of the patriarchy. I welcome the pain and the wounds of omission and falseness. I welcome the pain and the wounds of not being heard. I welcome the pain and the wounds of the distortion I welcome my personal wounds that I have experienced from my lineage and my learning in my whole body and my whole field for all of my ancestors. I welcome all now. And take a deep breath. And now we get to replace it. Dear heart, bring forth the original template of communication. Allow me, with my whole body and my whole field, to embody it. Allow me to embody the responsibility for my own reactions. The ability to not take anything personally, said or unsaid. The deep understandings of full body communication with compassion and all other attributes of enlightened communication now. And take a deep breath. Good. So, my friends, I hope that you'll come join me later today, where I will help you and show you how enlightened communication looks. By no means am I perfect at it, but I can see it. And if we can see it, we can get to know it. And by the end of the year, I hope that I'll have fully embodied it so that all my friends and family and all of you, that we can all begin to practice this, to use the original template for our new experiment in consciousness. And I hope that you'll use this recording over time many, many times to help you walk through the historical wounding that's happened to humankind, because that's why you're here. So we can be done with this and move forward. It's so important that as we move into our new experiment, that we know exactly what tools are available and how to use them. And many of those tools we'll keep using, like text, like TVs and screens, but we'll be running light through them instead. And it'll be very pure. Pure like you and your soul. And so I hope that this has given you some deeper relief, a good start to heal what has happened to you, to heal any shame about your own communications in the world, and know exactly why that happened. But here we are on the right track. We're working at this, and we're going to get it right eventually. I can't wait. And so I thank you and I love you. Namaste. Mwah.